Hey everyone, so one of the biggest questions of Wano is this the arc where Zoro gets Conqueror's Haki? And now that we're maybe about halfway through the arc, I've seen enough to say that yes, I am 95% sure that this is the arc where it's going to happen. So, why am I certain that Zoro is going to get Conqueror's Haki, and what signs have I seen that make me so sure that Wano is leading up to this? So first of all, let me just quickly break down why it's fair to assume that Zoro is going to get Conqueror's Haki at some point in the story. Now, a few years back, I actually made a video talking about whether or not Zoro fits the bill for Conqueror's Haki, and at that time, I actually said that it could go either way. However, in the 3 years since that video, we have gotten a lot more evidence to firmly convince me that Zoro will be getting Conquerors. So, to quickly recap my points from before, Zoro generally fits everything that we know of the criteria of Conqueror's Haki, and though there were a few areas where he didn't quite fit the criteria before, again, in the last 100 or so chapters, things have changed for him now to fit those criteria as well. So looking at the definitions we have throughout the series, Conqueror's Haki is described as the disposition to stand above others. Zoro fits this on many levels. Obviously, he literally wants to become the world's strongest swordsman, to stand above all other swordsmen, as Mihawk does right now. But beyond that, it's easy to forget that just because Zoro is a subordinate, if he were in any other crew but the Straw Hats, he would likely be the boss. And he has the personality of a boss. We see Zoro refuse to join Baroque Works unless they made him the leader. And other characters have even regularly commented on how Zoro does not seem to be someone who would follow others. Not to mention, other characters throughout the story have commented on how he seems like he could be the captain. Basically, the fact that someone like Zoro, who seems like a very commanding figure in his own right, chooses instead to follow Luffy, that's more so a testament to Luffy's greatness than in any way taking away from the fact that Zoro does indeed have the disposition to stand above others. Now, beyond that, Conquerors is often found in those who make a name for themselves on a global scale. And Zoro is obviously going to be the world's strongest swordsman. So yes, he checks that box off pretty much without a doubt. The one other descriptor for Conqueror's Haki that seemed unclear before was the nature of a king. This seems a little harder to argue. The nature of a king seems related to the disposition to stand above others, but before, when this idea was sort of introduced, we had gotten dialogue from Chinzhou about how the fact that Luffy had conquerors means he must have aspired, or he must be aspiring to be a king of some sort. And of course, Zoro does not aspire to be a king in any way. Now, for a while, pretty much the characters who had conquerors were literally all kings in some way. Like Chinzhou was the boss of a fleet, Hancock was an empress, Luffy wanted to be pirate king, all the Yonko obviously have conquerors, etc., etc. Even Rayleigh was nicknamed the Dark King, and we really don't know what that means specifically, but it has the word king in it. So, for some time, the fact that Zoro did not aspire to be a king, or a leader, or a ruler in any way, that seemed to disqualify him from having conquerors. However, there's a lot of new information that has swayed my mind on this. First of all, Katakuri has Conqueror's Haki. We have nothing to suggest that Katakuri has any desire to be a king of some sort. There's nothing kingly about his position. Clearly, in his case, the Conqueror's Haki is simply more so reflective of his natural disposition, which is extremely strong will, drive, standing guard over all the weaker Big Mom pirates below him, never falling on his back, etc., etc. So you can have that sort of innate disposition to stand above others without literally aspiring to be a king. And beyond that, Oden has really proven that without a doubt, as he truly did not want to stay stuck up in Kuri ruling anything in the slightest. He actually ran away from wanting to be a king of any sort. That didn't matter, his innate nature was still to have that 1 in a million greatness. His innate nature was to have that disposition of a king, even if he didn't actually aspire to be a king of any sort. And there's a very important line we actually get here when Oden asks to travel on Whitebeard's ship as his subordinate. And Whitebeard points out that Oden does not seem like he would follow others. This is exactly what Urauch says about Zoro, and to me that is a fairly strong indicator that Zoro is being written in that same sort of conqueror's mold, where characters are often surprised that he is a follower and not a leader. So basically, you can have Conqueror's Haki and not actually aspire to be a king of any sort. It's just that being a king is inherently part of your nature, whether you care to take that role up or not. And lastly, the general title of king now seems like it can be used more broadly than before. Like before, when I mentioned that, people called Rayleigh the Dark King, even though we didn't really know what that meant, now Ryuma has officially been brought up in the story as a very relevant figure in Wano, and I think it's important to bring up now that Ryuma was actually known as the King of Swordsmen back in the day. For anyone who hasn't already read Monsters, that's Oda's one-shot about Ryuma, that is now basically proven to be a canon part of the One Piece story, so I suggest you do read that when you get a chance. It's a good read. But also the point is that you can see that the character Zoro is based off is the King of Swordsmen. And in my old video on Zoro and Conquerors Haki, I just said that this was an interesting inspiration for Zoro, but now that we're actually in the Wano arc, and Zoro's potential Shimotsuki roots are really being played up, it basically means that he is very possibly the descendant of Shimotsuki Ryuma, who was the King of Swordsmen. Now, at some point after killing the dragon, it seems like Ryuma became so great that people actually started calling him the God of Swordsmen, but that's besides the point. Mainly it's the fact that the original King of Swordsmen is being talked up a lot in Wano, and he seems to be very relevant to Zoro's story. And so really it means that you can be declared a king for many different reasons. Like if you read Monsters, Ryuma was being called the Swordsman King back when he was just a wandering lone swordsman by himself. So bottom line, being called a king doesn't have that much to do with how many people you lead. It seems like the disposition to stand above is overall what matters more, and generally having that disposition suggests that you could command the allegiance of many followers if you so chose, but you don't have to. It's not a literal prerequisite. Now, beyond just definitions, for many the biggest indicator by far was that Rayleigh also had Conqueror's Haki, and I think most accept that the Zoro-Rayleigh parallels are there. Both are the first mates of the Pirate Kings, both are swordsmen, the scar over the eyes, etc., etc. Now, the common counter-argument that existed before was that, yes, Rayleigh has Conqueror's Haki, but that might have simply been a plot necessity, as Luffy just needed someone to teach him about all three types of Haki, so Oda decided to give Rayleigh Conqueror's Haki for that reason. And keep in mind, at that point in time, Rayleigh was the only character who had Conquerors who wasn't the leader of some sort of faction. So Rayleigh did seem like an odd inconsistency in that sense, to be sure. So at that time, I was open to the idea that, yeah, maybe Rayleigh having Conqueror's Haki was just out of plot necessity. However, what basically killed that argument was when Katakuri was revealed to have Conquerors. That basically confirmed that first mates, or vice captains, or whatever you want to call them, they can also have Conquerors. Now, of course, Katakuri is kind of a special case. I don't expect every Yonko first mate to have Conqueror's Haki, like I would be surprised if Marco did, as he doesn't really fit the bill, to me at least, for that type of character the way Katakuri is. But the point is that a first mate can have Conqueror's Haki, and I personally cannot imagine Oda making one of the Yonko's first mates have Conqueror's Haki and somehow not giving that to the Pirate King's first mate. It would be really, really weird. And yes, you could argue that, maybe Big Mom will go down and then Katakuri is going to lead the Big Mom Pirates, and that's why he's being written with Conqueror's Haki. And, that does kind of fit his role in the crew already, where Katakuri basically takes charge when Big Mom's not around. However, funnily enough, that also fits Zoro's role in the crew to a degree, where we regularly see him stepping forward and kind of taking charge a little bit whenever Luffy is not around, and I encourage you to go reread the raid on Enies Lobby and the Oars fight if you want a refresher on this. So, basically, Rayleigh had it, so that parallel is there, and Katakuri has it, so we know that Oda is generally open to the idea of first mates in general having Conquerors. Rayleigh wasn't just a plot necessity. And so now lastly, another argument I've seen is that too many people on the same ship have Conquerors. Too many people on the same ship having Conquerors would be bad, as first of all, only 1 in a million people are supposed to have Conquerors, so the odds should be really, really small. And second, it would take away from Conquerors being unique to Luffy among the crew if another one of his crewmates have it. I think recent chapters have pretty much killed that argument that there shouldn't be multiple people in a crew with Conquerors. As I said, the Big Mom Pirates have 2 characters with Conqueror's Haki, Big Mom and Katakuri. The Roger Pirates are now confirmed to have had 4, literally 4 Conqueror's Haki users on their ship, with Roger, Rayleigh, Shanks, and Odin. And let's not even get started with Rocks, like God knows how many of them had it. So, no, if anything, a top-tier crew, the Pirate King's crew, the most elite of the elite crew, should probably have more than just 1 Conqueror's Haki user. It just makes sense as, this isn't just a random collection of people. These are people that Luffy carefully chose. They're meant to be extraordinary individuals. So, if he ended up finding another person who would have Conqueror's Haki like himself, that makes sense. Like, the 1 in a million odds don't really apply here, since this is like more than a 1 in a million unique type of crew, you know what I mean? And I definitely don't think that Zoro having Conquerors takes anything away from Luffy. If anything, this adds to Luffy's greatness because that's how it's been the entire series. The fact that someone like Zoro is willing to acknowledge Luffy as his superior is what's so impressive. So really, the idea of having another Conqueror as your subordinate seems like Pirate King material. The Pirate King is, after all, the Conqueror among Conquerors. Not to mention that even though this is speculative, we have recently been learning about advanced Haki. Even though only advanced observation and armament have been confirmed, I would definitely be willing to bet that we are going to get advanced Conquerors as well. I've been saying Luffy will get advanced Conquerors this arc, and that this arc isn't really about armament Haki, but that's a discussion for a separate time. I think the point is, I do think advanced Conquerors is going to be a thing in the story, in which case Luffy will of course be getting that, and so as such, if you prefer the idea of Conquerors Haki being, I guess, unique to Luffy, I do think down the line when he has a better version of it, it will no longer feel like Zoro having Conquerors in some way ruins the specialness of Luffy having it, as at that point, Luffy will have something beyond that, basically. Now lastly, I'll say that even if you're not convinced so far, there are a couple of things that Zoro has that are specific to him that are weirdly close to Conqueror's Haki, but not quite. So, for example, Conqueror's is the ability to overpower someone's will. The closest thing we've seen to overpowering someone's will that wasn't literally Conqueror's Haki was Zoro against Monet. On top of that, Conqueror's Haki is basically like exuding an extremely powerful presence. I think Zoro is the only character in the series who multiple times has been said to have an intimidating aura, who doesn't actually have Conqueror's Haki himself. And the most recent time was at the start of Wano itself. Obviously this stuff, the Monet incident, the aura, it's not literally Conquerors, and obviously it's just speculation to say it's even related in any way. But I'm just saying the only person in the series who has weirdly shown like Conquerors-esque traits who doesn't have Conquerors himself is Zoro, but those are just some minor points I wanted to mention. So all that is to say that for a long time it has seemed very, very likely that Zoro will get Conqueror's Haki, and the few counter-arguments to the idea of him getting it have basically been killed over the last few years. So at this point it's just a matter of when. When is he going to get Conqueror's Haki? So now I want to talk about why I feel like Wano's story specifically is shaping up to be the arc where Zoro unlocks it. So obviously Conqueror's Haki isn't something you can develop through training or practice, it's something innate to you as a person, so you need to be born with it. And from everything I've talked about above, it does seem likely that Zoro has it. So the question comes down to, why hasn't Oda had him develop it yet? What is Oda waiting for? Well, I think he's been waiting for this arc. As much as I've said that Conqueror's Haki doesn't literally have to be tied to leadership, but is more so the disposition to stand above others that inherently leads to leadership, I do think that stepping up as a leader or being forced into a sort of a role as a leader can still play a big part of it. The reason being that so far there are only two characters in this series who we've seen unlock Conqueror's Haki for the first time. First it was Ace as a child, and then it was Luffy near the time skip. Now you might say that damn, Luffy was a real late bloomer compared to Ace, but I think it made sense because Ace as a child was already forced into that leadership role amongst the three brothers. He was the strongest, and especially with Luffy, he had to protect him. That's a sort of burden or responsibility that Ace had where his disposition to stand above naturally manifested. Basically, he may have simply been in a unique role that demanded that his nature as a king or whatever it is came out. Now on the other hand, Luffy didn't start to develop Conqueror's Haki until pretty late in his teens. But the timing actually makes sense, a lot of sense, if you think about the point that Luffy had reached in his journey. Yes, Luffy was always the captain of the crew from the start, but at the same time he wasn't truly a captain until Enies Lobby. I'm not going to go in depth into that arc here, but Enies Lobby was the first arc that Luffy truly was tested as a captain, where he actually had to face the burdens of being a captain, where he basically had to prove his worth as a captain from start to finish. It was the arc where the Straw Hats basically redefined their group dynamic, and by the end it wasn't anymore just that, we're all best friends, it was that they're all friends, but also a serious pirate crew that needs to have respect for their leader, and their leader needs to be able to command their respect. That was where the idea of Luffy needing to stand above the rest really started to become important, which could be tied to his disposition to stand above others starting to develop in general. Similarly, Thriller Bark compounded on that dynamic of captain and crew and focusing on what they both need to be able to do for each other. So that by the time Sabaody rolled around, Luffy was now coming into his own, as that nature of a king of standing above others was coming out, as only now was he truly being placed in a similar position to Ace. And to be clear, again, a leadership moment isn't necessarily the trigger for Conqueror's Haki to come out, as we saw in Amazon Lily. I'm just saying that with the characters Oda has written so far, their process of discovering conquerors, it's the process of them stepping up into a certain role that has ultimately led to that disposition to stand above others to come out in general. So, with Zoro's character and him seemingly being an extremely late bloomer compared to others, to me it seems like, from everything I talked about in the previous section, all the criteria fit. It's just that there's a certain context that his character needs to be put into before Oda is ready to give him Conquerors. Because yes, it's a special ability, but out of the 3 types of Haki, it's definitely the one that says the most about your character. So for someone like Zoro, where it's really been up in the air whether he will get it or not, I do think it's very important that he gets it at the end of some sort of storyline that develops his character, such that getting it is kind of the conclusion to that character arc. And I do think that hypothetical storyline is set to bring out his leadership in some way, similar to what preceded Ace and Luffy developing their Conquerors. Because with Zoro, he has always been just on the cusp of true leadership. As I talked about before, he frequently does take on a leadership role when Luffy is missing. And somewhat more blatantly, he is the one who regularly holds Luffy accountable for Luffy's leadership, and what being a leader means. However, Zoro has never truly officially taken the reins as the leader himself. Like, I'd say Sanji was pretty much officially, unquestionably the leader of half the Straw Hat crew during the Dressrosa split situation. They were even calling themselves the Spiral Hat crew, right? So Zoro has had moments where he takes the lead, but it's not the same. He's never really had to straight up pick up the role of being captain in the story so far. And I definitely think that's a deliberate choice by Oda, waiting for an arc that would give more shine for Zoro in general in order to truly put him in that position for an extended period of time. And now going into Wano, it seemed very likely that that would be this arc, as Zoro claimed towards the start that he would round up the Wano samurai once he got there, which sounds like an opportunity to lead. But if anything, what's really interesting to me is that instead of seeing Zoro in a new role in Wano, he actually seems to have regressed back to the old Zoro that he was at the beginning of the series. So what do I mean? Well, from the start of the story, Zoro was essentially a lone wolf. He really didn't want to join someone else. He was all about his own mission, and in the end, he only begrudgingly joined after making it very clear to Luffy that if Luffy got in the way of his goals, then Zoro would kill him. As the story progressed, Zoro of course became much closer with the rest of the group, but he's always been the most aloof and distant of the Straw Hats. That's just who he is at his core. He's stepped up to take charge a little bit when it's demanded, but that's about it. And obviously we're now at a point at the story where we know that he officially does value his captain and his crew more than himself and his own ambitions. He has basically become the number one pillar of support. But to me, the final step seems to be going, one step further from number one pillar of support to actually being able to take the wheel as a true leader when necessary. So let me explain what I see in Wano so far that's led me to believe this. Act 1 and Act 2, as I said, has Zoro regressing. Here he's basically not being a team player whatsoever. He's completely broken off from the rest of the group and is off doing his own, lone wandering swordsman thing. This is a far cry from the initial notion that he would round up some samurai. Zoro is doing his own thing regardless of what it means for the group, and the only time he's really acknowledged this is a very interesting line to me, which was when Zoro was evaluating all the different goals that the Alliance was trying to pursue and achieve, and he concluded that it was best for him to just not worry about it, as quote-unquote too many captains will sink the ship. That's a really interesting line, especially in the context of this arc. This is an arc where the idea of too many leaders is being brought up over and over, from the very start with Kaido talking about how there are too many conquerors running around, and that's a problem, with us learning about rocks, and how they fell apart because there were just too many leaders in one group. And even the entire structure of the Beast Pirates, which seems to be completely composed of former captains all being forced into one crew. As such, this idea that, many conquerors, leaders, captains, etc. doesn't work, that's an idea that Zoro himself simply accepts early on in the arc as an excuse for him not to get further involved. To me, that right there sets the basis for what type of growth he should ultimately experience this arc. The fact that this is an arc about the idea of how multiple conquerors can get along, the fact that Zoro started this arc claiming he would take on a leadership role, but has now almost blatantly been written in the complete opposite direction with even more aloofness and lack of responsibility, and the fact that he is now being regularly depicted alongside Luffy and Kid, the two other competing conquerors as well, which seems like a very deliberate pairing. But most importantly is the parallels with Odin, which are huge for Zoro. I didn't even realize everything that was there when I first did my Odin analysis, as back then, what I mainly realized was that Zoro's nothing happened moment, where he chose to take on everyone else's burden solely upon himself so that no one else would suffer, and refused to tell anyone about it, that was essentially exactly what Odin's entire dancing story was in a nutshell. Beyond that, we have the obvious Enma inheritance situation, but even more interestingly is something that I completely forgot, which was Zoro's introduction as a character in the first place. Zoro was suffering for the sake of a young girl. He had made a deal with Helmeppo to suffer for 1 month before Helmeppo would let him off the hook. Zoro had a terrible reputation among the townspeople, but he didn't care, so long as he knew he was doing the right thing. Finally, he discovered that Helmeppo was lying and would break the promise. Now, what was the story of Odin? Odin was suffering for the sake of his country. He made a deal with Orochi to suffer for 5 years, before Orochi would let him off the hook. Odin gained a terrible reputation among the citizens, but he didn't care, so long as he knew he was doing the right thing. Finally, he discovered that Orochi was lying and would break the promise. So basically, so much of what we see of Zoro throughout the series has actually been bottled and distilled in Odin, as well as a lot of the traits of Luffy, but for the moment we're focusing on Zoro. And that brings me to the most important point, Odin's greatest failing, which was in his responsibilities as a leader. Odin had the disposition of a king, but never wanted that role. Even though he had the disposition of a king and was not naturally a follower, he didn't care and chose to follow someone else. Ultimately, the only time he served his people as a leader, he did it his own way, by silently taking everyone's burden and putting it upon himself, without asking for help. However, while this was extremely noble, that type of leadership ultimately failed. And this to me opens up a really interesting opportunity for Zoro's character. Zoro, who has always had the disposition of the king, but who chooses to follow someone else, who is naturally a very distant, aloof person, who prefers to be on his own, who is the ultimate pillar of support for his captain and has really shined in that role before, but has never truly taken the reins and acted as a leader. Even his leadership in Thriller Bark was more so along the lines of, I will take this burden upon myself as my own burden, similar to Odin. It's not the type of leadership that Luffy has shown in the past. So all that is to say, if you are a longtime viewer of mine, and you know that I believe that this raid on Onigashima will end in failure, which I know I've been harping over and over, I strongly believe we will have a portion of the arc where Luffy may be taken out of the picture, as he often is in other arcs as well. And this time I think what we may be set up for is for Zoro to actually have to finally step up into a new role temporarily. Not even necessarily leading the Straw Hat crew, because God knows what every Straw Hat would be up to if they all fail at Onigashima. Personally, I would prefer them all to get their own storylines. So instead, maybe it's something as simple as Zoro actually having to round up the defeated Wano samurai again, as he initially talked about. But some sort of character arc where by the end, he will have earned his Conqueror's Haki. Because this is the only sort of context where it really makes sense to me. I don't even think something like beating Mihawk would be a moment where it makes sense for him to get it, as this isn't really anything to do with strength, it's about your character. And this is the arc where Zoro seems best set up to grow in this specific regard as a character. So if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe, and you can listen to my extended thoughts on the topic on my Patreon podcast, link in the description below.